This is Dr. Christopher Sendy with Nova Health and Recovery Ketamine Infusion Center in Alexandria, Virginia. I'm going to discuss how ketamine is administered intravenously and why 6 infusions and some of the nuts and bolts of ketamine therapy. So we know that the initial trial of ketamine was in 2000 with Crystal and Berman, where they took a small set of patients and gave a single infusion for treatment-resistant depression and found significant results. And Carlos Zarate's group in 2006 replicated this initial study, and they used a single ketamine infusion of 0.5 milligram per kilogram given over 40 minutes. And this was done to a small series of patients. And they noted that there were large effect sizes, that 71% of patients responded and 29% remitted within 1 day. And so you could see that basically before the infusion, the Hamilton depression score was, right around here. And then 1 day later, 71% of ketamine treated patients had basically improved depression, and close to 30% actually remitted. And that by day 7, 35% still had response after one single ketamine treatment, and it was at a dose of 0.5 milligrams per kilogram given over 40 minutes. And that 0.5 milligram per kilogram dosing was kind of just based on a dose that would approximate, not necessarily dissociating a large number of people. And this was, again, a randomized placebo-controlled double-blind crossover study. 17 patients were treated. So effectively, they found a rapid and robust effect, and that the effect started within 2 hours after the infusion was given. And this is just another graphical representation of this same trial, and that they found that the maximum improvement was at basically 24 hours. So they gave these patients the ketamine at that 0.5 milligram per kilogram dose right here. 40 minutes later, you could see there was some response in the ketamine group, which is purple, and that by 80 minutes, there was basically 40% of the patients had 50% or greater decrease in their depression scoring based on the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. And there were some responders in the placebo group as well, but there was definitely a significant difference between the ketamine responders and the non-responders. So by day 1, you can see the maximum response here. 70% had either a response or remission, and 35% remained with some response by day 7. So again, one infusion and multiple days, but there were still, again, a lot of people who began to remit back to depression. So again, the prior studies just used ketamine against a saline placebo, and Moreau in 2013 took 73 patients and did a control group against midazolam. Midazolam is like a Valium, Ativan, Xanax type medication given IV that does present some altered consciousness. And so they used ketamine versus midazolam, and everybody had major depression, and they used the Montgomery-Åsberg Depression Rating Scale, otherwise known as the MADRS score, and the key indicator was what happens at 24 hours. So they give a single infusion, and they give one group the Versed, the midazolam, the other group the ketamine. And they found that at 24 hours, which is right around this point here, that the ketamine group had the greatest response relative to the Versed or midazolam group, and that the separation between the two groups remained even out at day 7. So there were still antidepressant effects that were significant for the ketamine group even out at day 7. And the factor of odds of response was like 2.1 times greater for ketamine than for Versed or midazolam. So 64% of patients had a response, and it persisted over 7 days relative to midazolam. So if one infusion basically works, but then there's people that remit back to depression, maybe multiple infusions would be the way to go. And so Moreau in 2013 also looked at doing 6 ketamine infusions to see if you can get better outcomes, more rapid effect. So in this study, they took 24 treatment-resistant patients who were washed off their antidepressants and did 6 ketamine infusions over 12 days. That's 3 times a week at 0.5 milligrams per kilogram over 40 minutes. That's the same dose every day over 3 times a week for 2 weeks. And they followed these people out ultimately for 83 days, but they noted that basically by 12 days that 71% had a response in the MADRS scoring system for depression. And so 71% of the patients responded or actually had remission of their depression. And as far as the people that relapsed, about 50% of them relapsed by day 18. And so, again, by using a series of infusions, 6 over 2 weeks, they found a significant response that was very high, and they were able to get the time to relapse much lengthened out because of this series of infusions. So, basically, we know kind of why we're going to use 6 infusions because it seems like it makes the effect of ketamine last longer. So, Shiroma in 2014 also took 14 patients and wanted to see what the antidepressant response was, the remission response to 6 consecutive ketamine infusions while maintaining people on their antidepressants. So they used the same stable dose of 0.5 milligram per kilogram over 40 minutes on Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays and monitored these people for 4 weeks. And they found that in this series of infusions that basically 91% achieved response while 66 remitted after 6 infusions. And so effectively, by 4 weeks, 5 out of 11 of the subjects remained in response. They had either significant response in terms of decreased depression or even remission through the 4 weeks of follow-up. And so what they found was that repeated infusions were superior antidepressant outcomes as compared to a single infusion. And so basically, it would be preferable to use multiple infusions to basically maintain long-term efficacy with ketamine. Now, these other studies had always kind of stuck with a stable dosing of ketamine over a series of infusions, but dose escalation actually can even improve response even more. And so this study with Cousin and his colleagues in 2017 took 14 treatment-resistant patients, gave them 6 infusions over 3 weeks. And for the first 3 infusions, ketamine was given at 0.5 milligram per kilogram over 45 minutes. And the dose was increased to 0.75 milligrams per kilogram over 45 minutes for the subsequent 3 infusions. They used the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale as the key outcome measure. They found that at the first 3 infusions, only 7% responded, but after 6 infusions, close to 42% responded and 17% remitted. They resolved their depression. So escalating the dosing from 0.5 milligram per kilogram to 0.75 milligrams per kilogram over the series seemed to have a improvement of outcomes. There's also a review of using escalating doses of ketamine to decrease suicidality and treatment-resistant depression. Calabrese in 2019 took 219 of her patients in a retrospective review. They were adults and adolescents and gave them up to 6 ketamine infusions in a real-world outpatient clinic. And they were 6 serial titrated ketamine infusions between 0.5 to 1.2 milligram per kilogram within 40 to 50 minutes over 2 to 3 weeks. She used a PHQ-9 at baseline and before each infusion and just followed them along and found that suicidality, suicidal ideation markedly diminished in 79% and ceased completely in 59% of the patients, and that the average dose with remission of suicidal ideation was 0.75 milligrams per kilogram. So 0.75 milligram per kilogram seemed to be a good dose to decrease or remit in suicidal ideation in this group of patients. And then if you look at a more recent study by Fava and his group, and this is in 2019, they were using basically a dose ranging study to look to see if low doses or moderate or high doses would work for basically depression. And they used doses from as low as 0.1 milligram per kilogram all the way up to 1 milligram per kilogram in 99 patients. And they did this basically 5-armed study using doses of like 0.1 milligram per kilogram as a single dose of ketamine, 0.2 milligram per kilogram, and 0.5 milligram per kilogram, and 1 milligram per kilogram, and a placebo of midazolam. And then they followed traditional scoring systems for depression to see what happened. And they found that basically with the ketamine group, that the doses between zero point 0.5 to 1 milligram per kilogram gave the best response. They were pretty much similar. So you could see that the 1 milligram per kilogram was actually a little bit less effective than the zero point 0.5 milligram per kilogram, but they weren't apparently statistically different. And anything less than zero point 0.5 milligrams per kilogram was ineffective. So the low dose of ketamine at 0.1 milligram per kilogram was ineffective. And Versed or midazolam did not reach statistical significance. So bottom line is that between zero point 0.5 to 1 milligram per kilogram seems to work well. And so that's kind of a dosing strategy that you'll hear a lot of. So the other issue that we see is that ketamine doesn't just help out with certain mood parameters, it also helps out with wellness parameters. And 6 ketamine infusions can increase wellness indicators. And I've discussed this in other videos. Ketamine can increase calmness and energy and happiness, and it can decrease worry, sadness, worthlessness, and tiredness. And these are based on VAS score changes with 6 ketamine infusions of a standard 0.5 milligram per kilogram dose over 40 minutes on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule. And so these aren't really things that traditional antidepressants treat, and ketamine has the ability to help out with these wellness parameters. So this was just an interesting offshoot of this study. And this is just another representation of this same graphing here showing how calmness improves, energy and happiness improves, and how there's decreased fatigue and worthlessness and worry with ketamine infusions over the series of 6 infusions. And so the issue of maintaining effectiveness of ketamine therapies is always high on everybody's mind, because once you get undepressed, you don't ever want to return to depression. But a lot of people do relapse back into depression. And this study with Phillips in 2019 basically did a single infusion and a crossover type of situation here, where they would give ketamine to one group of people, and then Versed on the second study a week later, and then follow them along until their symptoms would reappear for depression. And this was 41 patients. And then what they did in the second phase is they give 6 ketamine infusions 3 times a week. And there were basically 23 participants in this one. Whenever the people relapsed into depression, they went ahead and gave a series of 6. And basically they found that 59% of the patients got antidepressant response, and 23% received remission from depression. And this was generally seen at the 3rd ketamine infusion. So this is evidence of where things start to happen is by the 3rd ketamine infusion. And their phase 3 portion of it was they then did weekly ketamine infusions in patients who then had some sort of relapse to depression after the series of 6 infusions. And basically, after these repeated infusions, individuals had at least a 50% improvement in their MADRS scores after these repeated infusions. And what they effectively found in this study was subanesthetic ketamine infusions can provide safe and efficacious reduction in depressive symptoms in treatment-resistant depression, and that you could restore the antidepressant effects of ketamine after an individual relapses from their depressive symptoms. So there isn't any tachyphylaxis to the benefits of ketamine. So if it, basically the person starts to fall apart, you just give them more ketamine and they can go back to their baseline effect. And so basically there was a maintenance of antidepressant effects in responders when they gave weekly infusions, and that the antidepressant effects of repeated infusions were cumulative, and it would decrease depression severity further with each infusion, and an increasing number of people would meet response as the number of infusions increased. And just as kind of another graphical representation, just showing in Shiroma's study, this back in 2013, that the more infusions you get, the better the response, and the more the remission. So the more the merrier. And intravenous ketamine versus Bravado. So IV ketamine versus the nasal spray Bravado, which is the FDA version of nasal spray ketamine. The question is, which one's better? And There is a meta-analysis that demonstrates IV ketamine beats Spravato in both response and remission. And in this trial with Vasquez and his group in 2020, they took 24 trials and had a total of 1,800 subjects comparing IV ketamine to Spravato. And what they demonstrated was that the response to IV ketamine was threefold increase relative to Spravato, and that the remission rates as well were higher with ketamine that was given in IV formulation, somewhere around 3.7 relative risk of this working relative to Spravato, which was 1.47. And that there were fewer dropouts in the IV ketamine group. So IV ketamine obviously had fewer side effects than Spravato. So how do we prolong ketamine's effect? And this review from McMullen's group in 2020 basically just went through strategies to prolong ketamine's efficacy in treatment-resistant depression. They took 450 articles, and 22 articles were included in this, and they looked at pharmacological interventions, psychotherapies, ECT, TMS, IV monotherapies, to see if they could prolong the antidepressant effects to ketamine therapies. And the only thing that worked was further IV ketamine. So in order to prolong ketamine's effect, you have to just give more IV ketamine over a period of time.